My name is Eliza Dawson, and I have been the keeper of the South Point Lighthouse for nearly a decade. I took this job because I loved the solitude, the peace that came with being out on this island, far from the hustle of the world. But recently, I've begun to question my decision. Something is wrong here. Something has always been wrong. It began with the arrival of the storm. It wasn't just any storm. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. The winds howled with an unnatural fury, and the sea churned as if it were alive. That night, as I sat by the lantern, I noticed something strange in the reflection of the glass of figures standing in the distance, just outside the lighthouse, in the mist. I stepped outside, hoping to find a fisherman who had gotten lost in the storm, but there was no one. Just the thick fog and the crashing waves. The figure was gone, but as I turned back toward the lighthouse, I felt something cold on the back of my neck. Something ... watching. The next night, the same thing happened. But this time, when I stepped outside, I heard a voice, a soft whisper carried by the wind. Help me. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. The voice was real, but I couldn't find anyone. I began to hear it every night after that. The whispers, the calling, a woman's voice, asking for help, begging for something. It felt like the voice was coming from the sea itself, as if the very ocean had a consciousness. Something was out there, and it wanted me to listen. I decided to investigate. I searched the lighthouse logs and old records, looking for any mention of strange occurrences, and that's when I found it. An entry in the log, written by the lighthouse keeper before me, John Holloway. It was the final entry he'd written before disappearing without a trace. The curse of the lighthouse has claimed another. The storm calls, and the sea answers. We are never truly free. The keeper is bound by the waves, and the lantern is its prison. The keeper must always remain. The light must never go out. At first I thought it was just some crazy ramblings, but as the days went by, the whispers grew louder. The fog rolled in thicker, and the woman's voice became clearer, closer. It was like she was inside my head, inside the very walls of the lighthouse, pleading, screaming, "You must help me. The keeper's curse must be lifted. The light must never die, or you will join us." I thought I was losing my mind. But then, on the night of the worst storm I'd ever seen, it happened. The lantern flickered, then went out. I rushed up to the lantern room, heart pounding, only to find the light completely extinguished. The room was cold, colder than it had ever been. And then I saw a figure, standing in the corner of the room. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in the old-fashioned uniform of a lighthouse keeper. His face was gaunt, hollowed out like a skull. His eyes were dark, empty, but he was staring at me, his mouth moving. Though no sound came from his lips, the fog outside was no longer just a weather phenomenon. It had come inside the lighthouse, curling around the room, thick and suffocating. The walls seemed to pulse with life, vibrating with an energy that made my skin crawl. Then, the voice returned, louder than ever. It was no longer a whisper, it was a scream. "The curse is yours. Now, you cannot escape. The light must never go out, or the sea will take you forever." I tried to turn and flee, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside the lantern room. The figure stepped forward, his bony fingers reaching out toward me, and in that moment, I realized the truth. The lighthouse wasn't just a job, it was a curse. The keeper's curse. I was never meant to leave. None of us were. The lantern must burn, always. It's the only thing keeping the sea from taking us all. But now, the light is fading, and soon, I will become part of the curse, just like all the others who came before me. My name is Thomas Rook, and for the past 3 years, I've been the only keeper of the Eldridge Lighthouse, a forgotten structure perched on a rocky island in the middle of nowhere. I've always loved the isolation. It gives me time to think, to reflect. But over the past few months, something has changed. Something, unnatural. It started with the weather. The fog rolled in thicker than usual, enveloping the lighthouse in a heavy, impenetrable veil. I'd go out to check the lantern every night, but the fog would blur everything, making it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. I'd hear the wind howl, the waves crashing violently against the rocks, and something else, something like a voice, but muffled, like it was coming from under the sea. At first, I thought I was hearing things. The isolation was starting to get to me. But then, the lantern started to flicker. This lighthouse had been standing for over a century, and in all my years of keeping it, I had never seen the light go out. But one night, it did. The light dimmed, flickered, and then went out completely. I rushed up to the lantern room, but when I got there, the light was already on. It was as if it had never gone out. I checked the mechanism, the fuel levels, everything. There was no logical explanation for it. That's when I started to feel watched. It wasn't just the usual eerie feeling that came with the isolation. No, this was different. It was as if someone or something was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. One night, I decided to stay awake and watch the lantern. I needed to figure out what was going on. As the hours passed and the fog thickened, I saw a figure standing by the edge of the lighthouse, watching me. It was a man dressed in the old, worn uniform of a lighthouse keeper, but his face was wrong. His eyes were hollow, black, like they had been burned out. His skin was pale and weathered, as though it had been exposed to the harshest winds for years. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring, and as I watched, the fog around him seemed to move in unnatural ways, swirling around him as if it had a life of its own. I tried to approach, but the moment I stepped outside, the fog closed in around me. The air became thick, suffocating. I could hardly breathe, and the waves roared louder, crashing against the rocks with a fury that seemed almost intentional. I stumbled back to the lighthouse, but when I looked up, the figure was gone. I thought maybe I had imagined it, but the next night, the same thing happened. The man in the uniform, standing by the edge of the lighthouse, staring into the fog. The whispers started soon after, faint at first, like distant voices calling my name, but the more I listened, the clearer they became. They were coming from the sea, and they were pleading, begging me for something I didn't understand. Help us, double quotes. The last keeper, must never leave. The voices grew louder, more desperate. I couldn't take it anymore. I searched the lighthouse logs for any record of the previous keepers, but there was nothing. The lighthouse had always been shrouded in mystery. I found no information about the man in the uniform. But then, I stumbled across something, chilling, a single line in the logbook, written by the very first keeper. The last keeper is doomed to stay. The light must never go out. If it does, the sea will take you. I couldn't comprehend it at first, but as the days passed, it became clear. The lighthouse had never been just a beacon. It was a prison, built to keep something at bay. The light was the key, the only thing holding back whatever lurked in the sea. And now, the light is flickering again. It's going out, just like the logbook said it would. And the figure of the watcher is waiting, standing by the cliffs, watching as the darkness rises from the ocean. The fog is thicker than ever now. The voices are louder, and the waves are crashing against the rocks with a force I've never felt. Before I know what I must do, I must stay. I must keep the light burning. But there's a part of me that knows it's already too late. The sea is coming, and the last lightkeeper is no longer just a title. It's a fate. My name is Henry Blake, and I've spent the last 7 years working at Lantern Point Lighthouse, a towering structure that stands at the jagged edge of the cliffs overlooking the northern sea. It's a place where the winds howl constantly, and the waves crash against the rocks with a deafening roar. For the most part, it's been a solitary job, with only the occasional ship passing by or the brief visit from a fellow keeper to break the monotony. But something strange has been happening here lately, and I'm beginning to wonder if the lighthouse is hiding something. It all started 2 weeks ago. One stormy night, the light in the lantern room flickered and went out, something that had never happened before. I rushed up to the top, expecting to find a simple malfunction, but when I reached the lantern, I found the bulb intact and the mechanism working perfectly. I didn't understand it. The light had simply gone out, as if someone had turned it off. I checked everything and found no issue. I relit the lantern and returned to my duties, but as the storm raged outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't the wind or the sea. I could feel eyes on me, cold and unblinking, from somewhere in the darkness. At first, I thought it was just the isolation getting to me, but the next night, the light went out again, and the next, and the next. I started to investigate, staying up late into the night to monitor the lantern. As the storm clouds gathered and the fog rolled in, I saw it, a shadow, standing in the farthest corner of the lantern room. It was tall, thin, and had the unmistakable shape of a person, but it was wrong. The shadow stretched unnaturally against the walls, bending and contorting in ways that no human form should. I froze, unsure whether I should approach or flee, but the shadow didn't move. It just stood there, staring into the distance. I called out, but it didn't respond. Slowly, cautiously, I moved closer. The closer I got, the more I could feel the cold, heavy air pressing against me. It was as though the very room was alive, breathing with the shadow. As I reached the corner, the shadow flickered and disappeared, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the lighthouse seemed louder. Every gust of wind seemed like a whisper. And then, I heard it. A voice, low and steady, coming from somewhere deep within the lighthouse. "You shouldn't be here." I rushed to the source of the voice, but I found nothing. The halls were empty, but as I turned to leave, I saw something etched into the wall. It was faint at first, but as I touched it, the letters seemed to become clearer. "The Watcher waits. The lantern keeps the dark." I didn't know what it meant, but I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The Watcher, what was watching? Me. And what did the lantern have to do with it? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation starting to get to me. But the shadow appeared again the next night, and the night after that, and every night since. It's always there, standing in the corner, unmoving, watching. And every time the light flickers and goes out, I hear the voice closer now, almost like a breath on my neck. "You shouldn't be here. The lantern cannot protect you." I'm beginning to understand now. The lighthouse isn't just a beacon. It's a prison, holding something trapped in the dark. And I think I've been here long enough to become part of its secret. I've tried to leave, but I can't. Every time I reach the door, it slams shut on its own. The fog outside is too thick. The waves crash too violently. I can't escape. And the Watcher is always there, waiting for the light to go out. My name is Ethan Frost, and I've been the keeper of Ashmore Lighthouse for over 15 years. The lighthouse stands at the edge of a foggy coast, where the sea crashes violently against the rocks, and the mist rolls in thick and heavy. For most of my career here, I've embraced the solitude of my job. The quiet is almost comforting, and the fog has always been a familiar presence. But the fog, it's not just ordinary fog. It started 2 months ago. At first I didn't think much of it. The fog rolled in more frequently, creeping up the cliffs and swallowing the landscape in a thick, suffocating blanket. It happens often on this stretch of coastline, so I thought nothing of it. But this fog, it had a strange weight to it. It clung to the lighthouse, seeping through the cracks in the walls, filling every corner with an oppressive chill. One night, I was walking the perimeter of the lighthouse when I heard something strange, a voice, soft, distant, but unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, calling my name, Ethan, I froze. I knew there was no one else on the island. No ships had come in, and there were no visitors for miles. My heart began to race, and I turned, slowly, searching the mist for any sign of movement. Nothing. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks. But as the night wore on, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The voice came again, closer this time, louder. It sounded almost pleading. Ethan, help me. I rushed back inside, my mind racing. There was no one here. There couldn't be. I closed all the windows and locked the doors, hoping to shake the feeling of dread creeping up on me. But as I sat at my desk, I noticed something strange on the walls. There were handprints, faint, wet handprints smeared across the walls, as if someone had pressed their palms against the stone. They were small, too small to belong to an adult. I grabbed a flashlight and followed the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The handprints led me to the lower levels of the lighthouse, where the storage room was. The air was thick with moisture, and the walls were damp with the fog that seemed to seep into every inch of the building. The voice came again. This time, it was right behind me. Double quotes, Ethan, help me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. But then, I saw it. A small, worn photograph on the floor, half buried beneath a pile of old equipment. It was a photo of a young girl, her face pale and hollow, her eyes staring out from the picture with an empty, desperate look. On the back of the photo, someone had written in a shaky hand, "The fog takes what it wants. Don't listen to it." I knew then that something was terribly wrong. The fog wasn't just a weather phenomenon, it was something else, something alive, and it had a hold on the island. The voices, those cries for help, weren't just echoes. They were traps, drawing me deeper into its grip. I spent the next few days researching the history of Ashmore Lighthouse. What I found was chilling. The island had been abandoned once before, after a series of mysterious disappearances. Sailors had vanished, never to be seen again, and the lighthouse keepers had come and gone, each leaving behind only fragments of their stories. But there was something else, a warning in the logs, a record of the lighthouse keeper from over a century ago, Hannah Greer, who had documented a strange phenomenon in the fog. She wrote about voices calling to her, luring her into the mist. She wrote that the fog wasn't just a natural occurrence, it was the spirit of the sea, taking the souls of those who dared to stay. And then, the final entry, written just before she disappeared. The fog is hungry. It doesn't care who you are or why you came. Once you hear the voice, it's already too late. Now, I hear the voice every night. It calls my name, drawing me toward the fog, urging me to follow. I know what will happen if I go outside. The fog will take me, just like it took the others. But I can't stop myself. The pull is too strong. I've tried to leave. I've tried to run. But the fog is always there, waiting for me. And as I sit here, writing this, I know that I'm just another keeper lost to the mist. My name is Maria Hawk, and I've been stationed at Crescent Isle Lighthouse for nearly 2 years. It's a quiet, lonely existence, surrounded by the vast expanse of the ocean. Crescent Isle is a small island, hardly visited, except by the occasional tourist or sailor seeking shelter from a storm. For the most part, it's just me, the lighthouse, and the endless horizon. But there's something about this lighthouse, something that I can't explain. It's as if it has a life of its own, an energy that hums quietly beneath the surface. The light that shines from the tower never dims, no matter how strong the winds or how fierce the storms. It's always bright, always burning. One evening, as I was making my rounds, I noticed something odd. The light wasn't rotating as it should. The beam stayed fixed on one spot, casting a steady light across the water. I checked the equipment, but everything seemed fine. There was no malfunction, no reason for the light to behave this way. But when I looked out to sea, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A ship, or at least, it looked like a ship. It was drifting toward the shore, but there was something wrong with its sails were torn, its wood was blackened, and it moved in unnatural silence. No engine, no sound of waves breaking against the hull. It was as if the ship was floating without a care, guided by the unblinking light. I watched, frozen in place, as it got closer. The closer it came, the more I could see shapes on deck. Figures, moving slowly, but with no clear purpose. I could see the outlines of people, but their faces were obscured in shadow. I tried to call the Coast Guard, but the radio wouldn't work. It was as if the island had been cut off from the rest of the world. The ship drew nearer, and I could hear faint whispers in the air. Not words, but sounds, moans, sighs, and the faintest echoes of voices crying out. I rushed to the tower, desperately, trying to get a better view. I couldn't take my eyes off the ship, and then, for the first time, I saw the crew up close. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were wide with terror, as though they were trapped in an endless nightmare. One of them raised his arm and pointed directly at the lighthouse, his lips moving, but no sound came out. I could see his mouth forming the words, "Help us," but there was nothing I could do. I was powerless, watching as the ship drifted closer and closer to the rocks. It was as if the ship itself was under some kind of spell, drawn to the light like a moth to a flame. I ran down the steps of the tower, heading to warn the shore, hoping to warn the ship's crew. But when I reached the beach, there was nothing. There, no ship, no crew, just the calm dark water and the eerie silence of the island. The ship had vanished, as if it had never been there. The next morning, I found something in the sand, a single, weathered piece of cloth, torn and frayed, like it had been ripped from a sail. It was stained with something dark, something that looked almost like blood. I've been stationed here for 2 years now, but I've never been the same since that night. I still see the ship sometimes, drifting toward the shore in the distance. The light from the lighthouse still burns, unyielding and bright. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I hear the whispers again, calling to me from the sea. And I know, deep down, that the lighthouse isn't just a beacon for sailors, it's a prison for those lost souls who are drawn to it, and for those of us who dare to stay. My name is Oliver Hayes, and I've been the keeper of Northfall Lighthouse for 23 years. It's a job that's not for everyone, isolated, cold, and often dark. The sea is unforgiving here, and the lighthouse beam has guided countless ships safely through the night. But there's one thing about this place that has always haunted me, the fact that I'm the last keeper. It started a few weeks ago, when I began noticing strange occurrences in the lighthouse. At first, they were small, the sound of footsteps, when no one was around, the flickering of lights in the tower, and objects in the keeper's quarters being out of place. I chalked it up to my old age, perhaps. I was imagining things. But then, one night, the bell tolled. It rang, echoing across the cliffs and reaching out to the dark, endless sea. The bell hasn't worked in years, and the idea of it ringing at all was impossible. I rushed up to the tower, my heart racing, expecting to find a malfunction. But when I reached the bell, there was no sign of damage or tampering. It had simply rung on its own. The ringing continued that night, unsettling. It wasn't until the next evening that I discovered something far worse. I was sitting in the keeper's quarters, reading an old logbook, when I heard a knock at the door. It was strange. The only people who ever came here were the supply boats that docked once a month. Curious, I opened the door, but no one was there. I stepped out onto the veranda and looked around. Nothing, only the crashing waves and the howling wind. But that's when I saw it. A figure stood by the base of the lighthouse, just out of reach of the beam of light. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, with no discernible features. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I called out, but there was no response. Slowly, the figure began to drift back, toward the rocks, disappearing into the dark. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was as if the lighthouse itself had become alive with malice. One night, while checking the equipment, I found an old journal buried beneath the floorboards. It belonged to a previous keeper, a man named Mr.BlackDread, who had worked here over 100 years ago. The journal was filled with strange entries, all written in a frantic, almost delirious hand. The bell rings, but no one answers it. The sea calls to me, and I am its prisoner. The keeper is always the last to leave. The last entry sent chills down my spine. I heard it's the voice of the one who waits. The bell tolled again, and this time, it was my turn. That's when I realized the truth. The keeper never leaves. I could feel the presence now, like something was in the tower with me. No longer was I alone in this isolated place. The lighthouse wasn't a beacon for ships. It was a trap, a prison for anyone who dared to take the job. The tolling bell, the ghostly figure by the rocks, everything pointed to one conclusion. I was next. I tried to leave. I packed my bags, ready to abandon the lighthouse. But as I reached the door, I heard the bell ring again, louder this time, almost deafening. I couldn't resist. I turned back, drawn to the tower like a moth to a flame. Now, I'm here, writing this as the hours tick by, knowing that I won't be able to escape. The figure is here again, watching me from the shadows. The bell rings in the distance, calling me to my fate, and I know, with every passing minute, that the lighthouse is waiting for its next keeper, and that keeper is me. My name is Ethan Brooks, and I've been stationed at the South Ridge Lighthouse for the last 6 months. It's located on a small island off the coast, one that isn't well known, so it feels like a place untouched by time. But what I've learned in my short time here is that this lighthouse is more than just a warning to ships. It's a gateway to something far darker. It all started when I found an old journal tucked away in a hidden drawer of the keeper's desk. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink had faded, but the words were still clear. The journal belonged to a man named Harlan Foster, the keeper before me. He had written about something strange. It wasn't until I read the last few entries that the unease set in. Foster had written about strange dreams, nightmares that seemed to come alive at night. He spoke of a feeling of being watched, of hearing whispers through the walls, even when no one was there. But the most chilling part was the part about the lighthouse beneath the waves. The journal spoke of a second lighthouse, hidden lighthouse deep beneath the water, just offshore. Foster had described hearing the sound of a bell tolling under the ocean, a sound that only the lighthouse keeper could hear. He claimed that the bell was a warning call from the sea itself, telling the keeper that the time was near. At first, I thought Foster had gone mad. The idea of another lighthouse underwater seemed impossible. But that night, as I stood at the top of the tower, I heard the sound of a bell. Faint at first, but growing louder with each passing minute. I dismissed it as a trick of the wind, but the sound persisted, clear as day. The next evening, I decided to investigate. I took the small boat out to sea, toward the spot Foster had described in his journal. The sea was unusually calm, and the sky was clear. I thought I was imagining things until I saw it. A faint glow emerged beneath the water, rising slowly, like a ghostly figure. And then, I saw it. A lighthouser. Perfect replica of the one I was stationed at, but submerged beneath the waves. The light was still flashing, though dimly, and the bell rang again. Louder this time. I froze, staring at the structure, mesmerized by it. It shouldn't have been there, but it was, and somehow, I felt drawn to it. I had to get closer. I anchored the boat and swam toward the eerie lighthouse. As I approached, I felt a coldness that seeped into my bones, a feeling of dread like nothing I had ever known. When I reached the base of the lighthouse, I saw something moving in the water shadows, twisting and shifting beneath the surface. I reached out to touch the lighthouse, but as my hand brushed the stone, something pulled me down into the depths. The water was suffocating, and I struggled against it, trying to break free. I saw the lighthouse above me, but it was no longer glowing. The bell's toll was deafening now, filling my ears, my mind. I heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper. "You shouldn't have come, ... I fought to swim back to the surface, but the shadows beneath the water were too strong. They dragged me deeper, pulling me toward the dark, cold heart of the ocean. Just as I thought I would drown, I was thrown back into the boat, gasping for air. I looked around, and the lighthouse was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. The sea was calm again, just as it had been before. When I returned to the lighthouse, I found the journal again. This time, there were new entries written in a hand that wasn't mine. Harlan Foster's writing had returned. His last words were clear. "The lighthouse beneath the waves has taken its keeper. The sea calls for you next." I don't know how I'm still here, or how I've survived, but I know the lighthouse beneath the waves is real, and it's waiting for its next keeper. I can feel it, calling me from the depths, and I know it won't stop until it has me. My name is Jonathan Hale, and I've been the keeper of the lighthouse at Black Rock Bay for nearly 30 years. It's a quiet place, tucked away on a jagged cliff, overlooking a sea that always seems to be angry. The lighthouse is old, too old. Some of the locals believe it's cursed, but I've never believed in such things. Until last night. I've always enjoyed the solitude of my work. The long hours in the tower, watching the waves crash against the rocks below, the rhythmic pulse of the light cutting through the night. But there's something about this lighthouse that doesn't feel quite right. It started a few months ago. The light, always dependable, began to flicker. At first I thought it was just a bulb, a minor malfunction that could be easily fixed. But every time I replaced the light, it flickered again. Then it began to go out entirely. I couldn't figure out why. The generator was fine. The mechanism that turned the light was fine. Yet, every night, without fail, it would extinguish. For a brief moment, before roaring back to life, I decided to investigate further. On the night I planned to explore the lower levels of the lighthouse. The air was thick with fog. The sea was eerily calm, a mirror of black glass stretching out as far as the eye could see. When I descended into the lighthouse's lower chambers, I felt an uncomfortable chill in the air. The walls were damp, and the sound of water dripping echoed through the stone corridors. At the far end of the hall, I found the old maintenance room. The light was still flickering as usual, casting strange shadows across the walls. But it wasn't the light that made my blood run cold. It was the footprints. They were small, almost child-sized, leading from the corner of the room to the old well. I hadn't seen those before. And worse yet, they were fresh wet, as if someone had just stepped through the damp stone floor. I followed the trail. The footprints led me to the well, an ancient structure at the heart of the lighthouse, and that's when I noticed the smell: salt water mixed with something far worse, something rotten. It wasn't coming from the well, though. It was coming from the floor beneath it. With trembling hands, I pulled aside the rug and found a hidden trapdoor. My heart pounded in my chest as I opened it, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading downward. Against my better judgment, I descended. The air grew heavier, and the sound of my footsteps echoed through the silence. At the bottom of the stairs, I found something that still haunts me to this day. A small room illuminated by a single, flickering candle, and in the center of the room, an altar, stained with something dark and viscous. The walls were covered in symbols I had never seen before, symbols that seemed to writhe and move in the flickering light. And there, in the shadows, I saw him. The figure was tall, dressed in tattered clothing, his face hidden beneath a hood. He turned slowly toward me, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, before I could respond. The door slammed shut behind me, and the light went out completely. I don't remember what happened after that. The next thing I knew, I was back in the lighthouse tower, and the light was shining as brightly as ever. But there was something wrong. The sea had become a storm of rage, and the waves were crashing against the cliffs, as if trying to drag the lighthouse down into the depths. I'm not sure how much longer I can stay here. The whispers have started again, and they come from the well. I can hear them every night, calling me down into the darkness. The lighthouse is no longer my home. It belongs to something else. My name is Alex Turner, and I've been the keeper of the lighthouse at Windward Point for just under a year. It's an isolated place, perched on the edge of a cliff, with the ocean roaring below. The lighthouse is old, built in the 18th. It has a history of strange occurrences, but nothing could have prepared me for the night of the phantom signal. It all started on a calm evening in late autumn. The wind was light, and the waves gently lapped against the shore. The lighthouse's beam swept across the horizon as usual, its light cutting through the dark night like a blade. But then, as I was monitoring the radio, I heard something I shouldn't have. A distress signal. It came through the radio static, faint at first. At first I thought it was a malfunction, but the message was too coherent. It was a call for help. Mayday, mayday, ... We're sinking. 47 degrees north, 120 degrees west. Please, ... help. We're trapped, ... I immediately checked the coordinates. The location was just beyond the horizon, barely visible in the distance. But there was no ship in sight, nothing that could explain the signal. No one else was around, just me, alone in the tower. I tried to raise a response. "Windward Point Lighthouse, this is Keeper Alex Turner. We hear you. What's your location?" But the only reply I received was static. Then, the signal cut off completely. I should have ignored it, but something urged me to act. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the base of the lighthouse to get a better look. The night was unnervingly still, the only sounds being the crashing waves below. Then I saw it, out on the water. There was a vessel, drifting slowly toward the rocks. It was a ship, old and weathered, but the eerie thing was, it seemed to be floating. No visible lights, no sound of an engine running, just a ghostly outline against the dark sea. I ran back up to the tower and grabbed the signal equipment. I tried to contact the ship, but again, nothing but static. The light from the lighthouse swept across the water, and for a moment, I could see the ship clearly. It was empty. No crew, no passengers, just abandoned. A cold chill ran through me as I watched the ship get closer. I could see figures on the deck, shadows, indistinct, barely moving. I tried to focus on them, but the figures seemed to shift, blending with the darkness. They weren't human, I was certain of that. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the ship drew nearer. It came within 100 yards of the rocks before turning sharply and drifting away from shore. I couldn't explain it. The wind picked up suddenly, and the fog rolled in thick, like a curtain, hiding the ship from my view. Then the distress signal came through again, but this time, it was more urgent, more desperate. "Please, ... Help. They're here. I rushed back to the radio, but before I could respond, the signal went silent. I looked out across the water, but there was nothing. The ship had disappeared, leaving nothing but an empty horizon. That night, I locked myself in the tower, too afraid to leave. The following morning, I checked the records. There had been no ship lost in the area for years, and no one had sent out any distress signals. I even contacted the Coast Guard, but they found nothing. I don't know what happened that night, but I can't stop thinking about it. The distress signal was real. The ship was real, but they shouldn't have been. I hear the phantom signal at night sometimes, faint through the static, and each time it seems a little closer. I can't help but wonder if it's a warning or if the ship is still out there, waiting. My name is Samuel Carter, and I've spent most of my life in the shadows of the sea. That is, I've been a keeper at the old lighthouse on the coast for years. The lighthouse, known as Morrow's Point, has stood tall for over a century, warning ships of the treacherous rocks below. But there's something about this place, a darkness that lingers. It started with the light. The light in the lighthouse never goes out. It never flickers, never dims. Most people would say that's a good thing, but there's something unnerving about it. Every time the sun sets, the beam of the lighthouse cuts through the night like a razor, never wavering, always watching. It's been that way for as long as I can remember. I've heard the rumors, of course, everyone has. They say the original keeper, Old Man Morrow, went mad before he vanished without a trace. Some say he drowned, others claim he was taken by the sea itself, but no one truly knows. The only thing that's certain is that the light kept burning. A week ago, something happened. I was alone in the lighthouse when I noticed the beam of light shifting. It wasn't much at first, just a slight tilt, but it was enough to catch my attention. I chalked it up to the wind or the mechanical gears, but the next night, it happened again. And then again. The light was moving, as if it had a mind of its own. Sweeping across the sea with a deliberate purpose, I decided to investigate. As I climbed to the top of the tower, the wind howled around me, almost as if the lighthouse was protesting, but I pressed on. When I reached the top, I looked out across the dark sea. There was nothing, just the endless stretch of water. But then I saw it, in the distance. Far beyond the reach of the light, I noticed something shifting on the horizon. A shadow, long and dark, moving steadily closer. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The shadow wasn't a ship. It wasn't a boat. It was something far worse, something that the light had found. I ran to the controls, but before I could adjust the beam, the shadow was upon us. I saw it now, clearly a figure, tall and gaunt, rising from the sea like a ghoul from the depths. Its eyes were black, hollow voids, and its mouth opened, stretching impossibly wide. And then, the light went out. I don't remember much after that. The darkness swallowed me whole. When I woke up, I was back in the keeper's quarters, lying on the floor. The light was still on, its beam cutting through the night. But there was something different. I could hear whispers, soft, distant whispers, coming from somewhere beneath the lighthouse. I don't think I'll be here much longer. The sea is calling me, and the light, it's still waiting.